All right, today we are continuing our message series in the book of Acts. We're going to be Acts chapter 21. We'll be on page 115 in your pew Bibles. If you didn't have your own Bible with you today, there's a Bible in the seat in front of you underneath it. Feel free to grab that. If you don't have one, you can even keep that one. And if you're using that Bible like I am up here, then we're going to be on page 1115. As I was heading into our message today, thinking about it, I thought about a time years ago where in elementary school, in 5th grade, I got in deep trouble. Now, I don't know how many of you guys, maybe some of you guys were better students than I was, but unfortunately, I visited the principal's office far too often. It seemed like whenever a new principal came, I took it upon myself to find some way to go visit them. And my parents, who were both school teachers, were often not terribly happy about that. And in one case, my 5th grade year, I was about to graduate from elementary school in my hometown of Ontario, and I discovered, along with some friends, that on the back side of the school building, there was a big cinder block that was missing in the foundation of it. And I don't know if it was meant as an access area or what the case was, but we figured out, as elementary students can do, that we could actually fit through that hole. I mean, it was tight, but we could actually fit in under there. And so I ended up getting a group of friends together, and this kid, there was a friend of mine named Jeffrey. Jeffrey got together with me, and it started with just he and I going down there. And we crawled under the school, and there were a bunch of balls and jump ropes and stuff like that. And over the years, other students had found this same thing and thrown them into the abyss. And so we felt like archaeologists down there, just exploring under the church. And we decided this isn't good enough. We've got to do better than this. And so we made a plan that in a week's time, we'd get a bunch of our classmates together. We'd post out people to keep watch. And then we would go under the school with our flashlights and go explore. And we did. That glorious day came 1 week later. And with the normal 5th grade judgment, we went for it. We crawled under the school, and we actually crawled from one end of the elementary school to the other. And all of that would have worked out okay had somebody not talked to the teacher about what was going on. And suddenly I was in a whole lot of trouble. And I don't know where your parents were when you were growing up, but with my parents, the teacher was always right, because they were teachers too. And so there wasn't a whole lot of getting away with it. And I remember that day that I went to the principal's office and I got scolded for crawling under the school, and just how long that day was as I sat in class and I worried about, what is my dad going to do when I get home? I bet you there's a spanking waiting for me when he hears about this. And I felt a little bit like somebody going before an executioner, you know, just that the whole day it drug on, the bus ride, it kept feeling like we were going closer and closer to my grave. I got off the bus, I went home, my parents got home a couple hours later. I was being watched by a neighbor who watched us, and when they got there, actually they were surprisingly merciful. But that feeling of impending doom, many of you guys might recall that from your childhood. When you knew you crossed a boundary you weren't supposed to, and you're going to suffer consequences for it. Sometimes in our Christian walk, God will ask us to go into places, and maybe not even because of any fault of our own, God will ask us to go into places that are dangerous. And we read about the Apostle Paul today. I can't help but feel that maybe in the back of Paul's heart, he felt some sense of doom that matched that as he was headed off. Now, we've been going through the book of Acts, and as we've been going through it, we've been hearing about the history of the ancient church, Christianity, as it formed. And so Luke, the physician who's the author of the book of Acts, wrote the Gospel of Luke first, and accounted for, by interviewing eyewitnesses, accounted for a huge swath of the life of Jesus Christ. And the book of Acts picks up where the Gospel of Luke left off, and now it begins talking about the origins of the church, where it came from, how it was formed. And as we've gone through this, we've actually covered 20 or 30 years worth of time. And we've heard about the very earliest parts of Christianity forming under the disciples in Jerusalem, how it expanded from there to Judea and Samaria, and has begun sprouting and going across the whole earth. And a big part of how God has spread the gospel across the earth is through the use of somebody who probably no one would have expected, a man by the name of the Apostle Paul. Now, Paul was originally called Saul, but Paul had a dramatic experience where he began persecuting Christians. He was traveling all over the world, capturing them, dragging them off to be tried, in many cases to be executed for their faith under Jewish courts that existed. And on the road to Damascus, a city in Syria, trying to round up more Christians, Paul had a dramatic experience where Jesus Christ appeared before him in a vision. And when Jesus appeared before him, he called out Paul for persecuting him and for persecuting God. And Paul saw the error of his ways, and there's a dramatic story we've read about in the book of Acts. But the interesting part is Paul went from one of the top persecutors of the church to somebody who in his lifetime would suffer more for the church than most people who lived. There was a big turnaround that happened there. Paul came to clearly understand who Jesus was. And as we begin our passage today, we have seen Paul has been progressing through his third missionary journey. He has spent 3 years just in the city of Ephesus alone, spreading the gospel. And the churches that Paul has planted have grown so powerfully that there are major industries in the ancient world, such as idolatry manufacturing, that are actually being stunted because of the number of people who are figuring out that worshiping that statue makes no sense, but there is a living God who I can actually follow. And that epiphany has begun to change the world. It's actually changing the history of the world in the long run, we'll see. But Paul is returning from that journey. He's making the return trip. And as our chapter ended last week, we saw Paul stopping at a place called Miletus, which is not far from the major city of Ephesus in the province of Asia. And Paul is going to he stops there and he talks to the elders from the church in Ephesus, and he charges them to defend the church. That they should go and be advocates of the church. They should make sure evil people don't come into it and stir up division and cause trouble. And that they should just live that out by growing the church and reaching out to more people for Jesus. And as that passage left off with Paul tearfully saying goodbye to those men, our passage picks up today. Paul will now be continuing his journey towards Jerusalem. All the while, Paul has heard prophetically at several points, as we've read, that as he heads to Jerusalem, he is not heading to a comfortable place. That persecution is what awaits him there. So we'll read this section. I've got a map up on the screen, and we'll leave that there. In a moment, we'll talk about some of the places that we've gone through, just so you guys get a notion of where these events happen, because these are real places that actually exist. And this overlaps well with recorded history. So there's a great testimony in that to the truthfulness of the Bible. All right, we'll begin in chapter 21 with verses 1 through 6. Before we read that, though, I'll ask you to take one more moment just to come before the Lord in prayer. Let's get our hearts in the right place. Heavenly Father, every word on this page was put there by you. Your Spirit inspired men such as Luke to write down how the church started from nothing and grew to a force that changed human history. Father, I know that we can learn from it ways to grow the church here today. That the truths of what happened then are just as true now, and that you, God, are the same then and now. Help us to use this as an opportunity to connect with you, to read your holy word, to see you more clearly, and through that, to see ourselves as well. Lord, we ask these things in Jesus Christ's name. Amen. All right. Chapter 21, verses 1 through 6. After we had torn ourselves away from them, we put out to sea and sailed straight to Kos. The next day, we went to Rhodes, and from there to Patara. We found a ship crossing over to Phoenicia, went on board and set sail. After sighting Cyprus and passing to the south of it, we sailed on to Syria. We landed at Tyre, where the ship was to unload its cargo. We sought out disciples there and stayed with them 7 days. Through the Spirit, they urged Paul not to go to Jerusalem. When it was time to leave, we left and continued on our way. All of them, including wives and children, accompanied us out of the city. And there on the beach, we knelt to pray. After saying goodbye to each other, we went aboard the ship, and they returned home. Okay, so the conversation with the Ephesian elders ends, and that leads Paul to head off. Now, let's look at the map up here. As we discussed before, Antioch is where Paul's starting point was, where his missionary began. He traveled through modern-day Greece and around into what was then Macedonia. He then eventually backtracked back, and on his way over, he stopped over in Ephesus. And in Ephesus is where he spent 3 years of this missionary journey. But this was probably a 5-year journey as he was out spreading the gospel. And it's good to note, of course, Paul didn't have cell reception clear back to Jerusalem. That didn't exist. He couldn't send an email out. Nobody really knows what's going on in Paul's life at this time, except the people who are here in these cities. Now, as Paul returns, he knows that he wants to talk to the elders from Ephesus, but he's worried if he stops there, he's going to get bogged down too long, because there are thousands of people who come to Jesus because of him there. Many of them want to talk to him, And so he asked the elders from Ephesus to travel to Miletus to meet him there, and that's where our last chapter ends and where today's picks up. Now, as we read, he stops at cities like Kos. You might notice that the spelling of Kos on this map is different than the spelling in your Bible. It varies some. It's all based on the Greek word, and we're transliterating the Greek word for what that ancient island was. But Kos is a little island on the way. They stop at Rhodes, and finally at Patara. Now, good to know that these are common ports to stop at, and the type of vessel that Paul would have been on would have been a small sailing vessel, really just meant to travel the coastal lands. In the Greek, it denotes this. So he's in a cheaper means of transit, but through a type of shipping that happens more often. Small vessels, often in these island chains, would be used to carry supplies from place to place. And so these missionaries go along, they stop at each of those places for short stints, and then they have a more extended stint when they hit Patara. Now, Patara is a major seaport, and from there they're getting on a big ship and going to begin to head down towards Tyre and cross the Mediterranean Sea. While Paul is there, he stopped over for 7 days. And what we see Paul do whenever he stops is he looks for other believers in the area who will put him up. Now, this is not only financially a helpful thing to do because it cuts down Paul's ministry's expenses, but it's good to note that throughout the New Testament we frequently see where Christians will do this. They'll go stay with other Christians. And you might ask, why not just get a room at the Motel 6? What's going on here? Why doesn't Paul go that way? It's good to note that in the ancient world, typically stays at inns were often combined with idol worship and with ritualized prostitution. So many of the inns you would have gone to, there would have been that expectation that you're here and we'll send somebody in a while to help you settle into your room. And for a Christian, you can imagine this could lead to some bad perceptions. Whether they actually did it or not, just staying in that room could lead people to think, look at what he does. He claims that he's following God and that he's this holy person, but I can guess what was happening in that room last night. So for early Christians, the discipline of hospitality was infinitely more important even than it is for us today. I mean, it's still extremely valuable, but you would have had this look of impropriety if you had gone to a place like that. So you really needed to find local believers that you could stay with. In this case, Paul finds some families that are willing to put him and his traveling friends up. They are together for a week as all of the freight is unloaded off of this major shipping vessel. Again, there are no cranes or shipping cargo containers or anything like that. Men have to go into the ship and walk it all ashore or send it by boat all ashore. So it takes several days to unload the vast amount of cargo and to load up more cargo. And while he's there, he begins bonding with his people. And there's this really sweet imagery that we see of Paul at the end of that section, along with all of the people with him and all the families that hosted them, these Christians who probably didn't know each other at all prior to them. But that for a week they've lived together and they've grown to love each other and to know each other. And all of these families come down to the beach as Paul is getting ready to board this big freighter vessel and head over back towards Jerusalem. And as they do, they pray for him, they pray for guidance for him, and that he'll be taken care of. Now you also notice in here it says that many of the disciples, led by the Spirit, understood that Paul was going to undergo persecution when he went to Jerusalem. This naturally poses the question, why is Paul heading there? If Paul knows there's persecution ahead, why is he heading that way? And as we'll see in a little bit, Paul actually is going to stick with this plot and decide to continue forward to Jerusalem, which prompts the question, why is God telling these people that the danger is there? What does he hope to accomplish through that? We'll discuss that in our next section in more depth because it's going to build a little bit between now and then. So let's go ahead and pick back up. Paul has traveled south past the Isle of Cyprus, that little island right in the middle of the Mediterranean. He's headed towards Tyre and continuing towards Jerusalem. We'll now read verses 7 through 16. We continued our voyage from Tyre and landed at Ptolemais, where we greeted the brothers and sisters and stayed with them for a day. Leaving the next day, we reached Caesarea and stayed at the house of Philip the evangelist, one of the 7. He had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. After we had been there a number of days, a prophet named Agabus came down from Judea. Coming over to us, he took Paul's belt, tied his hands and feet, and said, "The Holy Spirit says, in this way the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem will bind the owner of this belt and will hand him over to the Gentiles." While we heard this, we and the people there pleaded with Paul not to go to Jerusalem. Then Paul answered, "Why are you weeping and breaking my heart? I'm ready not only to be bound, but also to die in Jerusalem for the name of the Lord Jesus." When he would not be dissuaded, we gave up and said, "The Lord's will be done." After this, we started on our way up to Jerusalem. Some of the disciples from Caesarea accompanied us and brought us to the home of Manasseh, where we were to stay. He was a man from Cyprus and one of the early disciples. Okay, so Paul lands back on mainland. He's gone past Cyprus and arrived at Tyre, and he now heads down to Caesarea. Now, as a reminder, the city of Caesarea, Caesarea is, by Roman perspective, the capital city of Palestine and even the area of Syria, but particularly of Palestine, which is where Jerusalem is located in the lower right-hand corner of your map there. To the Jewish people who resided in that area, Jerusalem would have been considered the capital city because culturally for them it was, and for decades, Jerusalem was the capital city of the nation of Israel for hundreds of years, actually. And so they would have seen that as a central point. However, Caesarea was built by King Herod. He spent an extravagant amount of money. It was actually considered one of the wonders of the ancient world because of all of the great temples that he built and the complex docking system that he installed in that major port in Caesarea. And he renamed the city, Herod renamed the city Caesarea, in order to try to garner favor with Caesar, the emperor of Rome, which was a common practice in the ancient world. It's part of why you'll see several places named Caesarea. A lot of people wanted to name a prominent town after Caesar. Caesarea is where Paul and his companions begin to stay with a man named Philip the Evangelist. Now, this is not to be mistaken with Philip the disciple, but Philip the Evangelist, they say, is one of the seven. That is to say, he's one of the 7 deacons who was initially appointed in the earlier part of the book of Acts. And we have actually read previously in the book of Acts about Philip, about how he was one of the earliest Jewish people to branch outside of Jewish territory and to go start spreading the gospel to Gentiles. And he won many people and planted churches, and eventually he settled there in this port city of Caesarea. We've actually seen previously other leaders in the church, when they're passing through there, have come and stayed with Philip while they're there. Interesting to note, Philip has 4 daughters, all of who are unmarried, and all of who have the gift of prophecy. So they're supernaturally speaking things they have no business knowing. Often, probably at times, telling people truths that would have been in Scripture, but the Scripture hasn't been fully written yet, so it's not accessible to most people. And so they're in that house. I can't help but think, you think about having 4 teenage girls, and most teenage girls are really confident in their amount of knowledge, but imagine how much trouble you'd have if there were 4 of them and they were all prophets. You'd really be in the doghouse trying to keep them straightened out. But poor Philip. Anyway, he's in this position, and not only is Paul in this house with 4 women who are prophetesses, but on top of that, a prominent prophet by the name of Agabus comes and joins him. Now, Agabus had foretold previously about the famine that was going to hit Jerusalem, and actually on Paul's journey, on this 3rd missionary journey, like his second one, Paul has collected a large offering from each of the towns that he's planted churches in, and he's now returning with that offering to go give it to the church in Jerusalem, because as recorded outside of the Bible, during this time, there was in fact a famine. There was a large famine that happened. Many people were starving to death, especially in that region. Food prices soared, and so with Christians being in a tough position, and many of these Christians having to hide to begin with because it was considered illegal by many of the Jews to be a practicing Christian, and there was heavy persecution that followed that. The other churches are supporting them in that way. Well, what Agabus said about the famine came to be true, and now Agabus comes to Paul, and if you kind of envision it, you can imagine Paul is there, and he's not wearing a plaid shirt and blue jeans. He's wearing what would have been closer to a bathrobe, a cloak in the ancient world, and with that a belt to help hold it shut, typically a leather belt. And Agabus, who's a well-respected and well-known prophet, well-known throughout Christendom, comes in that room, and I have to imagine he must have made people stop and think, whoa, he's here. Why is he here? What's he got to say? Agabus walks up to Paul, grabs his belt, pulls it off of his waist, comes over, he sits down, and he uses the belt to wind around his hands and his leg and to bind himself together like an ancient equivalent of handcuffs. And Agabus says, in no uncertain terms, the Spirit of God led me here to tell you that the person who owns this belt is going to have this happen to him through the Jews. when he visits Jerusalem. Now, we've already heard several times, other people in the church have heard bad things are coming from Paul. And generally the response was, don't go, Paul. You shouldn't head that way. Well, it prompts the question, is God giving a conflicting message to those other believers? Is he telling them one thing and Paul another? They overlap on the fact that there's going to be persecution. But it seems, to answer that, God's consistent. There isn't that division here. Likely what's happening is that Paul knows it's coming, and Paul has accepted it. But everybody around Paul now knows it's coming too, and they've got to decide what to do with that. Now to them, what makes the most sense is to say, don't go there at all. If you're going to go there and bad things are going to happen to you, people are going to hurt you, then don't make the journey. Just stay away, Paul. And yet Paul seems to know that his call to the gospel and his call from Jesus is different. He has to go to that place, even that place where he knows he's going to suffer, because he has to tell those people about who Jesus is. It's interesting to see in Paul's life, it's not really a question of his priorities. In spite of the fact that he zealously persecuted Christians for years, now Paul is heading out, and at the risk of everything, he's dead set on going to Jerusalem. And even with one of the most powerful prophets in this era, Agabus, coming and telling him, hey, it wasn't a lie. God wasn't playing make-believe before. This is going to hurt. Even then, Paul's set on it. And eventually, his followers around him, Luke himself being included. You notice that Luke, the author of the book, is using the inclusive pronoun we. I'm talking about we collectively. We tried to talk him out of it. We told him he shouldn't go do it. It's too dangerous. But he insisted, so we said, all right, let God have what God wants. And they left it at that. Now we're going to see how things unfold for Paul. There's been this big lead-in with all of these warnings coming, and we don't know exactly how things will come, except that, if God's right, as he always is, it may not be pretty. I'll mention that we're only going to read through verse 36 today, and we've got 2 more sections left. This very last few verses of this chapter really relate to next week's message. So we'll now read verses 17 through 26, and we'll see how Paul's received at the church in Jerusalem. Verse 17. When we arrived at Jerusalem, the brothers and sisters received us warmly. The next day, Paul and the rest of us went to see James, and all the elders were present. Paul greeted them and reported in detail what God had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. When they heard this, they praised God, and then they said to Paul, "You see, brother, how many thousands of Jews have believed, and all of them are zealous for the law. They've been informed that you teach all the Jews who live among the Gentiles to turn away from Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or to live according to our customs. What shall we do? They will certainly hear that you have come. So, do what we tell you. There are 4 men with us who have made a vow. Take these men, join in their purification rites, and pay their expenses so that they can have their heads shaved. Then everyone will know there is no truth in these reports about you. But what you yourself are living, or that you yourself are living in obedience to the law. As for the Gentile believers, we have written to them and our decision that they should abstain from food sacrificed to idols, from blood, from the meat of strangled animals, and from sexual immorality." The next day, Paul took the men and purified himself along with them. Then he went to the temple to give notice of the date when the days of purification would end, and the offering would be made for each of them. Okay. So Paul has come and he's talked to the early believers, to this early church. James, who was heading the church at the time, along with all of the elders of the church, get together, and all of them want to hear what's happened. He's been gone probably for what amounts to about 5 years at this point in time. And again, there's no convenient communication means over long distance. So for all they knew, Paul was dead at year 1 and was never coming back. It's really been a mystery to them. And now he's here, and they get to see this person who at first they were all scared of, and now they've all come to respect as a leader in the church, and hear about his third missionary journey. And Paul recounts detail after detail, no doubt talking about the dramatic things that happened in Ephesus, where he was nearly killed on a few occasions, and where so many people came to know Jesus that it actually undermined a lot of their industries. Paul tells of the good news of the thousands of people who came to discover Jesus Christ through the years that he was out there. And to their credit, the people at the church in Jerusalem were excited about it. They're stoked. They've been undergoing persecution there. They've been trying to survive in rough conditions. But in spite of whatever hardship has happened there, God has received glory, and God's kingdom has been growing. More and more people have come to realize who Jesus is. And they're excited for that. And yet, at the same time, they informed Paul that while he was gone, a whole lot of Jewish people became Christians. Well, that on the surface is a good thing. The challenge that they point out is that many of those people who became Christians still followed the Jewish law devoutly, which is accepted in early Christianity. In fact, even today, we have what are called Messianic Jews. And they're Jewish people who converted and accepted Jesus as the Messiah, but they still go ahead and practice all of the Jewish traditions that go along with being a devout Jew. So back then, that's the way most of the Christians who were in Jerusalem would have looked. They were Jews who converted to Christianity. They still followed most of the law of Moses, but they saw that God had spread the gospel to the Gentiles, and they didn't hold them to the same standard. In fact, James points out, well, we already sent a letter. In fact, they sent it through Paul, in part, explaining to any Gentile that was out there, these are the moral requirements. You don't have to follow all of Moses' law, but you do actually need to avoid a lot of these idolatrous practices, like eating animals that were strangled as they were sacrificed to idols, or any sort of adultery, which also was often a part of ancient pagan worship, but also just in principle should be avoided. So they reiterated those warnings, but they told Paul, we're concerned for you, because everybody here has started to believe, even people inside the church, they've started to believe that you are telling every Jewish person outside of Jerusalem, you guys, the whole law of Moses, that whole Old Testament thing, throw it away. Put it in the garbage. It doesn't mean anything. In fact, don't circumcise your kids. Don't follow any of it at all. Just reject it. Is that accusation true against Paul? It's just this on the surface. No, right? Paul never says that. In fact, Paul, interestingly, during this time period of the third missionary journey, he writes books like Galatians that are actually going to be informative to people in these various provinces he's visited. He's actually getting out information on exactly what they should do relating to the law. So not only has Paul not teach this, but he's actually had prominent teachings that say the exact opposite. But it doesn't matter, because in the court of public opinion, people may look at him and just assume, hey, we all heard this, and we all believed it, so it must be true. Does that ever happen in a small town? Yeah, there's a risk there, right? Yeah. We will either find out the truth or make something up that sounds close enough, and we'll go with that. Sometimes that's the way the rumor mill works. And in this case, in Jerusalem, it's happening. And so they have an idea for Paul. They tell him, here's what we want you to do, Paul. You need to appear as if, legitimately, you actually care about the law of Moses, which Paul, to his credit, does. Paul sees that all as being fulfilled in the new covenant. He sees it all as having roots for the Christ to come. So Paul values those things. And their idea is, we have 4 men here who have taken vows. Now, vows in ancient Judaism would have been similar to the vow of the Nazarite. The vow of the Nazarite actually would have been the template, which is the vow that Samson, back in the book of Judges, had followed through it. So typically, if you take a vow, you would choose a handful of things that you're going to give up, kind of like fasting. And it might be avoiding intimacy with your mate. It might be avoiding food or avoiding certain places that you like to go. But you choose to sacrifice some things. And you do this either to appease God or to find favor with Him. And for a set period of time, whatever you vowed, it could be 4 days or 4 years, for a set period of time, you would hold to that vow. And during the time it was happening, like we read of with Samson, for men in particular, part of what was required is that they let all of their hair grow out, that they don't actually groom themselves. Now, this is distinct from most ancient Israelites because in the law of Moses, it actually spells out the way that men are supposed to be groomed. And interestingly, it does this because the way that you're groomed in the ancient world was indicative of where you were from. Egyptians typically were clean-shaven. I don't know how many Egyptians we have here today. But and if you were a Philistine, typically you would have had a goatee. And so there were all these different grooming things. And offhand, people seeing you walk down the street would say, oh, that guy's got a big goatee. He's probably a Philistine. They would associate that and make that connection. For the Jewish people, God said that Jewish men had to keep their hair trimmed. It couldn't get too long. I'm sorry, that means that the images of Jesus as a hippie don't quite work out, if he's the fulfillment of the law. But they had to keep their hair trimmed and short on their head, and that their beards had to actually be grown out. They could be trimmed, they could be well kept, but they had to have a full beard. You couldn't shave your cheeks off, because then you'd look like a Philistine, and you couldn't shave it all off. The only exception is, at the end of a vow, if you'd made one of these vows, and you were looking for God's favor, at the end of it, typically what you would do is you would go and you would pay to have somebody go and shave off your face and your head. You'd be completely bald, and then you would go to the temple after a time of ritualized cleansing, a week of ritualized cleansing. You'd go to the temple, and you'd make sacrifices to God to give thanks for it. Now it happens that in the early church, there are 4 men who have made those vows and they've completed them. And so what they need to rightly do now is go through the week of cleansing, and they need to schedule their appointment at the temple, and then go pay to have sacrifices made and to have their hair shaven, both of which are going to be expensive because electric shavers don't exist. That's not a thing. So this is all part of the plan, and Paul is encouraged, we want you to go and pay for the completion of their vow, which was a common practice in Judaism. If you wanted to bless somebody who was making a decision like that, or give your endorsement, in a sense, to it, it was a common practice for somebody to come and say, all right, if you're going to make that vow, then I'll be ready, and I'll come, and when you get ready, I'll pay to have your head shaved, and we'll pay for you to have your sacrifice in the temple, or whatever it might be. And that's my way of saying that I'm really behind you in what you're doing. So Paul now, he's going to go and he's going to pay for this to be done for all of these men. And then even though, as far as we can tell, he's not, in fact, himself in the middle of a vow, he is going to go with them to the temple, and he'll schedule everything, which he does, and then he'll go through the 1 week of cleansing, which would have been required because he had been associating with Gentiles. So for him to even enter the temple, he would have had to go through 1 week of cleansing, of ceremonial cleansing, before he was allowed in. Now the point behind this is not about a bunch of people freeloading off Paul to get their vow completed. The point is, Paul's being accused of disregarding the law of Moses. But if Paul goes and actively endorses 4 people following through with the law of Moses, and then he himself goes through a week of ritualized cleansing before he ever enters the temple, then it seems like that sort of negates the accusation. Because why would somebody who thinks that the law of Moses is utter nonsense go to such great efforts to follow it? Effectively, these church leaders are trying to put this circle of protection around him to say, you'll be above reproach if you do this. If they think you rejected the law, they'll see that you did all these things, and they'll know that's not, in fact, the case. Let's see how effective the plan is. We'll now complete the passage. We'll finish out by reading verses 27 through 36. When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law and this place. And besides, he's brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." They had previously seen Trophimus the Ephesian in the city with Paul, and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. The whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some of the crowd shouted one thing and some another. Since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great that he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him." All right, So Paul is in the temple. He has done everything by the book. He's followed every rule. He's even endorsed other people being a part of it. It seems like he ought to have some layer of protection. But while he's there, some Jewish believers from the province of Asia, which as you can see on the map is the resting place of Ephesus. Ephesus is the capital city of that area. So people from where Paul had the lengthiest part of his ministry happened to be over in Jerusalem as devout Jewish people coming to the temple to offer sacrifices. And while they're there, somebody notices and says, "Is that Paul?" "That is." And soon, all of those Jewish men are in an uproar. They start shouting out and say, "Fellow Israelites, get together, get everybody together. We have a problem here. This guy, Paul, is undermining everything that he teaches. He speaks against Judaism. He speaks against Jerusalem. He speaks against the temple itself, says it's all useless, that nobody should be doing it." And on top of that, if that wasn't bad enough, they say, he also brought Gentiles in here with him. Now, of course, we know that the first accusation is patently false. Added to it is the accusation that Paul brought a Gentile into the temple. Now there is a certain portion of the temple where a Gentile could enter and be, but they're now in an inner court of it. They're not allowed to be there with a Gentile, and it would have been a serious offense had Paul done it. The interesting part is that, of course, Paul hadn't done that either. People had simply seen him a week prior when he wasn't in his ritualized cleansing, out with Trophimus the Ephesian, one of the people who's an evangelist with him. And because he was at one point in time with somebody who was a Gentile, they went ahead and just assumed or inferred that he had brought somebody into the temple then. The people who hear this get into an uproar. Nobody stops and asks, "Well, hold on here. Which one of these guys is actually a Gentile? What are you talking about?" There's nobody defending Paul. Soon people from all over the city are pouring into the temple and they are forming a lynch mob. And they don't take long. I guess they want to respect the temple enough that they grab him and drag him outside of it. And then they start beating Paul to a bloody pulp. Everybody taking turns beating on him. And in the midst of all of that, the head of the Roman cohort, basically the officer in charge of Jerusalem itself, who would have commanded approximately 1,000 people, 10 units of 100. He gets word, perhaps from an informant or perhaps just from hearing the uproar, that there is a riot breaking loose in the middle of Jerusalem. Now, as the head of the Roman governments in the area and the ranking officer in the area, his responsibility is to quell any riots that happen. And historically, prior and after this point, the Jewish people at several points have revolted and actually tried to overthrow Roman rule in their province. So that is going to be the top concern for this guy walking into the situation. Is this a rebellion? Are we about to have a civil war? Do I need to kill a bunch of people in order to calm them down? And so, when the officer shows up, the Jewish people who are there, probably several times in their lifetime, depending on how old they are, having seen what the Roman government does when you riot and rebel, suddenly calm down a little bit. It's kind of like a big mob and suddenly a whole bunch of cops show up and suddenly we're not so sure we're as bold as we were a moment ago. And so they stop what they're doing, they stop beating Paul. You can kind of imagine Paul is probably a bloody hulk on the ground at this point, and the officer wades out into the crowd and says, "What is going on here?" Now, naturally, I'm sure some of the people said, "Hey, this guy is undermining the law of Moses, he's undermining the temple." To an unbelieving Roman soldier, that would have been pretty unimportant. He could have cared less. But, as we'll see from next week's passage, a few short verses later, this Roman officer seems to believe that Paul is actually part of a faction of people who are of assassins who are trying to undermine the Roman government. So probably in the midst of the crowd, somebody else yells out, "This guy is leading a rebellion, he's trying to overthrow the government, he's already gone out and killed a bunch of Roman soldiers, you should kill him." Now, of course, this isn't true, but it's a convenient thing to say because for most of this crowd, they just want Paul killed. And so if we tell a little bit of a lie, and they do the job for us, that's easy enough. We didn't have time to finish the job ourselves, but maybe the Romans will just take him and kill him. So they launch that accusation. The Roman officer standing out there is hearing conflicting accounts. We got 6 different identities that this guy's supposed to be, and he's not sure what to make of it. So he arrests Paul, he drags him off and says, "I'm just taking him with me. Y'all can run this line of questioning later, but he'll be in our barracks and he'll be waiting there." And so he begins to take Paul off. Paul, for his part, has been beaten so severely that now he's bound, but he's having to be carried by Roman soldiers back, and he can't even make it up the stairway into the barracks. He is too physically destroyed to be able to manage that beating from all of the whooping he just took. And so Paul now heads into the temple, into the barracks. He's headed that direction, and next week our passage will pick up at that point. The natural question from all of this, I suppose, is, what do we do with this? And what I find fascinating about this passage is we have Paul and a bunch of men with him who are extremely deep, grounded, godly guys, like Luke, the author of this book. And each of them received the same information from God, but in spite of that, each of them have different things that they feel like should be done with it. Paul knows that God's told him he's going to go and he's going to suffer, and that's what's coming in Jerusalem. And yet he also knows God's calling him to go there. And when Paul learns that, he doesn't run the other way. But these other leaders in the church, when they find it out, come to the conclusion of, you shouldn't go anywhere near that. If you're going to get hurt, if you're going to have to suffer, then you should aim for a zip code on the opposite side of the country from Jerusalem. That is not the place for you to be. Let me ask you this. If you were in that position, what side would you err on? Would you be more like Luke or more like Paul? Would you be ready to boldly walk into a mess knowing exactly what it was going to be? Or would you say, boy, I want nothing to do with that. Even if it's spreading the gospel, that sounds a little scary for my pay grade. I'm out. I think it's not a coincidence that God tells all of these people what's going to happen to Paul. Paul already knows. You don't need to send 5 different prophets to tell him. He understood the first time he heard it. And he vocalized as much. He repeatedly said, I'm going to Jerusalem, and in the long run, I think I'm going to be led to Rome, and God says I'm going to suffer much. I know that's going to be at the middle of it. Paul's already assimilated the information. But the people around him, for some reason, God keeps sharing this with. And I would suggest to you a big reason he does it is because a lot of them are not sure whether they're ready to put the gospel first. If they were asked to do the same thing, they would have some hesitance. And I relate to that. It's scary, this idea. But for Paul, he knows God's call comes first. What God told me to do and the spreading of his word has to be the top priority, even if I suffer for it. It doesn't matter. And God uses Paul's willingness to walk into this fire as an opportunity to teach everybody around him what they need to be ready to do themselves. Many of the people here are going to have a martyr's death. Many of them are going to walk into this fire themselves in time. But Paul is used by God as a testimony that they need to embolden themselves even when you know things are going to go wrong. The application for us today is to do the same. It's to have that boldness, to pray that God will help us to have courage, even when we know it's going to be hard to have that conversation. I'm sure all of you guys have people who are friends or family members who don't have a relationship with Jesus yet. And oftentimes we get scared. Well, what if we hurt their feelings? What if they don't like us anymore? What if they get angry at us? And I'm not saying be brash. I'm not saying be mean. That's the last thing I'm saying, in fact. But do be bold if that's what God has called you to do. Frankly, our nation itself, more and more, has stepped away from faith in God, and our culture has become more and more hostile. And for many of us as Christians, the temptation becomes to keep our mouth shut, keep our head down, and hope it goes away. But that's not the calling we have as Christians. As Paul demonstrates here, we're supposed to go out and boldly proclaim what God says. We're supposed to walk, even if it's into danger, and be willing to pay the price for that. I think today's message really gives us a strong reminder of that. And I hope we can take courage from it this week, or in whatever situation God leads you to face. At this point, I'm going to ask one of our elders to come forward to lead us in our communion and offering time, and I'll ask our deacons to as well. We're going to serve the elements. As they do that, I'll ask you to join me for a moment of prayer. Lord, I'll be the first to admit I lack boldness many times when I should. And yet, Father, we see in the Apostle Paul a willingness to face down certain pain and suffering and to boldly do it for you. Lord, help us to see those moments where you're calling us into that exact same action. Help us to have humble enough hearts that we'll make the decision. Sometimes, Lord, I wonder how often you're not talking to me or others here because our hearts are hardened, because we're not ready to receive it. Because even if you said go, we plug our ears and want to look the other way. Father, we can see leaders in the church in our reading today who had that exact same issue. We pray for boldness. At a time like this, that is exactly what we need, to be bold for you and quick to lovingly proclaim who you are. Please guide us through this, we ask in Jesus Christ's name and